concerns a young married man just a year out of college who had taken a job with a manufacturer in this western Wisconsin town, namely La Crosse. The crash came, and as everyone knows, it started in New York, spread nationwide, and filtered down to the small communities with such speed and rapidity that nobody could catch up to it. Personal funds, personal estates, homes, farms were lost overnight due to the depreciated value of money, and was evidenced by the bank situations where in La Crosse 2 banks failed before the government could call their moratorium and close all banks. It resulted in some very prominent people being so humiliated that they took their own lives.
Really?
Yeah. And it made such an impression on the local people that businesses were closing right and left. People were actually walking the streets bewildered, not knowing what was coming next. And of course the city person immediately tried to find a job on a farm, anything to do, any work that could be gotten was taken. And it finally resolved itself to a lot of these people going out in the bottomlands cutting wood and bringing it in for sale, but there was no market because nobody had any money. But they didn't have money to buy coal or fuel, and so they would make some arrangement, which is the old-fashioned system of barter. I'll trade you some wood for something to eat. And that persisted for some little time. In my particular instance, I had started work at $60 a month, which in those days was considered a very good job. And as the Depression developed, my employer, rather than to have any more forced layoffs, which they had done, decided that the living level was at a point where if they were to go any lower, it would dissolve the whole thing. So they took a voluntary poll, and all the employees agreed to a 1-day-a-week layoff with no pay. In other words, work one less day a week and one less day of pay, rather than to get laid off and get no pay at all. In my particular instance, everything was going fine, and the afternoon before my layoff day came up, the boss called me in and asked me to do a special job for him, which had something personal to do with his son. So I said, well, I would be glad to, but under the agreement, tomorrow is my supposedly voluntary day off. He said, this is personal, this is private, so don't you worry about it. So as a consequence, during the whole period that program was in force, I was able to take my forced off day and use it for a personal problem for the boss. So I was very, very lucky and never lost a day's work during the whole Depression. Everybody who was driving automobiles stopped There was a mad influx of the appearance of bicycles. People were riding bicycles. People were on the street corners selling apples or anything to get money to live. And the situation was just terrible. The market dropped out of the real estate business. Businesses closed, for sale signs were up on all the store windows, because there was no way at that time, with the banks in such bad shape, was anybody able to accumulate any funds to establish buying power, unless you were fortunate enough to have had actual dollars put away in a safe deposit box. If you did, then you could go out and buy things for so much cheaper than they were really worth that it was pathetic how some of the people profiteered. Mm-hmm. Those who had some funds could go out and buy and then hang on to it and resell later and make a handsome profit. But that was the exception that proved the rule. By and large, the blue-collar worker suffered terribly. There was unemployment all over. The white-collar worker, the office worker, suffered because his layoff came because of the fact that production was cut down, and management suffered because they had to dispense with practically all of their high-salaried executives, and it just was a retrenching all the way from the word go. As far as retail in La Crosse was concerned, I would say that possibly a good 25% of the smaller businesses were hurt seriously by the Depression, and a portion of them actually closed and were never able to reopen. It was a rebuilding program from the bottom up. What happened was there was a restriction of credit. You couldn't get credit anyplace. You couldn't go to the grocery store and get a bill of groceries and say, I can't pay you, because the grocery had to pay for that stuff when he got it. So the restricted credit caused part of it, and then those that were in business had a terrible time trying to collect the accounts that were open, that were out, because nobody had any money to pay them. And as a consequence, when they couldn't get the money that they had due them, they had no money to buy more merchandise to keep themselves going. So it was a lack of capital on the retail business that hurt them. The residential aspect of the thing, I started out at the beginning of the Depression living in a 2-car remodeled garage into a 3-bedroom, into a 3-room bungalow. And it developed to the point where we were very comfortable. We had no money. Nobody had any money. But we were able, on our $60 a month, to keep going and see the thing through. There was no such thing as jobs. Nobody could get a job. Everybody was out looking for anything that they could do, and there just nothing to be had. There was too much available labor and no money to pay them. The professional men, like the doctors and the dentists, they, of course, were hurt. But in most cases, they were financially stable, and they did and could extend some rather long-term credit to people, which took a good many years for them to recoup. And a lot of that never did come back, because some of those doctors just didn't have the heart to bleed people to death to make them pay for something that they happened 3, 4, 5 years ago. So the professional people were hurt from the standpoint of having to extend credit. And of course the hospitals went right down to the bottom. People just couldn't afford to go to the hospital unless they were deathly sick. And the hospitals in turn had an excess of nursing help, had an excess of all kinds of help, and they in turn had to cut back so that they were in terrible shape. So that all in all, in a small community like La Crosse, everything was just like pouring everything into a big funnel and letting what could get through and survive. And on the only thing that did occur, they did start the WPS program, the work program, which did provide some work for some of the men, and then they had the CCC camps for the teenagers. So it did provide, the government did come in and establish something in the way of help for some of them, but it was inadequate as far as solving the whole problem, although it did help a little bit with the pressure.
What are those CCC camps?
That was the citizens thing. That was the youth program. They went out and planted all these pine trees out in the open areas. Mm. Now those trees are up 15, 20 feet high now. Mm. Yeah, the kids did that. And your WPS, that was your works program where the government underwrote, like they'd come into La Crosse and they'd put in a storm sewer and they'd hire all unemployed males that didn't have any kind of a job just to dig the ditch to put the sewer pipe in, see? Mm-hmm. And the government underwrote the bill until the city could pay for it after they got back on their feet. So they provided a certain amount of help to the general public. But if there's anything else, constricting it to individuals cuts quite a bit out of the deal.
Yeah. Do you remember any experience, you said you were pretty lucky, but were any of your friends really bad off?
Well, yes. I saw personal friends who were actually fired or laid off from their jobs, and they wound up by going out and cutting wood out in the bottoms and bringing it in, and then they'd go down to the market with it and just hope that somebody had to have some wood to burn and would trade something to eat. And some of them were lucky enough to get a deal where they could sell the wood to somebody who had, like a small store that had a stove in it instead of a furnace, and get some store credit there. But as far as welfare was concerned, more people applied for welfare than there was welfare money to take care of. And there are actually relief stations, and I think they were established by the Red Cross to help and feed these people. They set up soup lines and things like that until the shock of the whole thing sort of leveled off, and people began to settle down and get their feet on the ground and try to make some semblance out of chaos. But it was just terrible those first few days. People were going to the banks, and they wanted to draw what money they had out of the banks. Well, 2 of the banks couldn't do it. They didn't have enough cash on hand. They couldn't pay off all their depositors. And the other 3 were able to hold their heads above water, and they made it. But 2 of them went under. Mm. And it was not because they were insolvent, but because their money was tied up in such things that they couldn't convert it into cash fast enough because the price of everything was dropping so fast. In other words, if they owned stock at $50 a share today, in 2 hours it was down to 10. And if they in order to sell, it'd take another hour, it might be down to 5. So they got $5 a share for a stock that was worth 50. And it just took the bottom right out of everything. See, people lost money just as the clock turned, people lost their fortunes.
Yeah. And so eventually some people killed themselves?
Oh yeah, in New York and Chicago, you could read in the papers they were jumping out of windows and everything else, because particularly these financial counselors who were counseling people's estates, who were managing people's affairs for them, they'd have a client's worldly possessions wiped out. There was no way they could come back and say, well, I can do everything I can do for you because you're done. It's wiped out, the mark wipes you out. And rather than to face the music day after day, a lot of them committed suicide. Jumped out of windows in the big office buildings, and it was just, that's why I say the national aspect of the thing was really bad, because it spread across the country like wildfire. It just went bingo. It started, of course, in New York, and the market broke, and it affected the big banks. And the Federal Reserve banks couldn't get currency out fast enough to the smaller banks, so that the smaller banks could pay off their depositors. As a consequence, there'd be what they call a run on the bank, and the people would stand there till the bank was out of money, out of paper money and silver dollars. Not that they didn't have them, they had them, but they didn't have them in the bank, see, when they couldn't get them. And so the government, Washington, ordered a bank moratorium. All banks, good and bad, all banks were closed by law until these banks could get stabilized a little bit and find out what was going on. Well, what happened on the banks did go on. There were the ones that had poor investments. In other words, they had invested their money in stocks. It went so low there was no recovery. See? Now the better banks were holding government bonds and things like that, which if the government goes busted, everybody goes busted. And they could, by holding a moratorium, they could analyze the status of the bank and decide whether they'd allow them to open at the end of the moratorium or not. And if they didn't, then the government and state-appointed examiners would come in and examine their situation, and they'd say, well, there's only one thing you can do is to sell your assets and pay off your depositors. There's so much on the dollar. There's not a thing, there's no way, there's no recovery in sight for you. That's what happened to 2 of them.
How long did it take the other ones to open up again then?
Well, they were ready to go as soon as the moratorium was over. And I think the first moratorium was for 2 weeks. And after the end of 2 weeks, then those that could declare themselves solvent were allowed to open again. Or was it 2 months? Gosh dang, I'm not sure. You better say 2 months for sure, because that gave them a chance to check all of them. Yeah, 2 months. Took them a chance to check most of the banks and find out. But you see, the ones that had the runs on them and that were actually out of cash, there wasn't a damn thing they could do. They were said there was one manufacturer up there in La Crosse who had built 100 homes, and they had a lot of money involved. And when the crash came, it wiped them right out. And it took the bank with them, because this bank had loaned them the money to build these 100 homes. So there they sat with 100 homes. Nobody had any money to buy them, so what are they worth? You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
When you've got a surplus of commodity and no medium to buy with, you're in tough shape. Now the converse is true. When there's a lot of money and there's a short supply then you can raise the price and get more for it than it's really worth. And that's what's happening today with houses, particularly in the real estate business. And price way out of range, way out of line what it should be. So that's just the other side of the coin, so to speak. But there was a hunger, there was despair, there was a great deal of apathy, and people were moving in with relations, and moving in with other people, renters, particularly people who were renting. Hell, they couldn't pay their rent, so they'd move in with their folks, move in with a brother, or move in with a cousin, or move out on back out to the farm. And the ones that had it the best through the whole damn depression was the farmer.
Really? Why?
He had the ground, he could raise something to eat, he could live.
Oh,
He had cows, he could milk cows. If they had to eat, they could kill a cow and they'd have meat. Or they could kill a hog and have pork. And they were in better shape to withstand the crash than anybody else. And it was amazing how many young people who had come from the farm, just like that, they went right back to the farm just as quick as they could go. And the farmers, as much as they tried to, they'd put on extra help because theirs then was the problem of getting a crop in to help these people to get commodities back on the market, see? And they would hire as many as they could, but you can't saturate that either, you know. So it was a bad situation. But
how did it eventually turn out? I mean, how did the depression end?
well, the government stabilized things to the point where through their financial support to communities, they were able to get them back. But individually, each individual had to retrench and start all over again. At least in my particular case, we we stuck with our $60 a month, and we budgeted every nickel so that we knew where every penny was going to go. And we didn't have to pay a rent because we lived in this remodeled. That was one good thing about it. And then, as business started to come back, they abandoned their compulsory one-day layoff thing, and business started to pick up, and sales started to pick up, and they began to hire more people, and finally, the thing began to turn back to normalcy, or semi-normalcy, but it took a good many years to build it back. Because of the lack of two things. One, capital. People were very, very skeptical about putting money in investments after having just been burnt. You couldn't expect people to buy stocks, and so the industry would have to go cautiously, but go as far as they could with what they had in the way of capital to expand. And when they could show any kind of real semblance of progress, then they could go to the bank, and the bank would extend them some credit, see? And that's the way they did it. It was a very slow, gradual process. It didn't turn overnight by any manner of means. But it reestablished itself, and then you had the Roosevelt years come in right behind it, where you're going to have 2 chickens in every pot and 2 cars in every garage. But that's about the size of it. So that gives you enough stuff to...
Well...
Unless you have some more questions.
So the only good points of the Depression were if you had a lot of money to begin with that wasn't in the bank, or what you said?
No.
You said,
if you had funds in a safety deposit box, Not in a savings account, because the banks were frozen. See?
Yeah.
But if you had funds in a savings deposit box that you could get access to, or had them tucked away at home in a shoebox, you had capital, you had money to live on until this thing stabilized itself. See?
Yeah.
That was the whole thing. And a lot of people actually had money saved at home, which fortunately they could rely on. And that's why you talk to some of the older people who still don't believe in banks. They won't put their money in a bank because of the depression.
Yeah.
Well, there's a depression. So-and-so's money was there and he lost it all. I'm not going to put the money in their bank, whether they pay interest or not. I'd rather have the money and not get interest than not to have the money at all. And some of them are very, very set in their ways on that. It was awfully hard. Well, then, of course, that was followed up by the government coming out with this federal insuring savings accounts to induce people to put money back in the bank. See, your Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, now, you can have a savings account in a savings and loan or a state or a national bank, and practically all of them, I don't know of any of them that aren't members of the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And that insures that money to you up to $20,000. So if you get $20,000 in a savings account, don't put in another 10. Start another savings account.
Mm-hmm.
See? Now I think, Larry was telling me the other day, I think they raised that to 40 now. 40,000. But they had to do something to induce people to put money back into circulation.
Mm-hmm.
Because those that did get into the banks when they had the run, and those that did get their cash out, they hoarded it. They just took it home, put it in the shoebox, and that's where it stayed. Whether the banks opened or not, they didn't come back to the banks with it for a long, long time.
Do you think like a depression could happen now, or do you think it?
I don't think a depression will be so much in the sense of as I knew it, but I do think you're going to have a tax revolt in this country. People are fast and furiously getting fed up with high taxes, both personal and sales, and it's evidenced itself by the California Proposition 13 thing, the way that's gone wildfire over the nation. And the people are not going to put up with high taxes and excessive wasteful spending by the government for very much longer. Evidenced by that one community out in, well, I don't know just where it was, but they said that the personal property taxes were too high. So everybody in town signed a petition and said, we're not going to pay taxes this year. And they said, oh yes you are, you go to jail. They said, all right, you put the whole town in jail, where are you going to put them? And by golly, the city council met and they decided that something had to be done, and they lowered the taxes for the people. When enough people voiced a unified opinion about something, they well set up and take notice. And that's the only thing that Davis did with his Proposition 13 in California. He told enough people about what was going on to get them excited, and they went to the polls and voted it out. Voted high taxes out. And I think that's what's going to happen nationwide in this country. I think people are going to have a tax revolt. They're just going to refuse to have the government charge such high taxes and then wastefully spend the money as they do now.
Yeah.
If it was being spent logically, why it'd be different. But and that's the only way you're going to get the thing back on an even keel, is to have a regression of excessive spending and a reduction in taxes, And then, of course, they're going to say, well, the people have too much money, that'll prompt inflation. It won't prompt inflation because people will then have enough money so they'll begin to reinvest. Now, there are very few of the young married people, let's say from the 20 to the 30 bracket today, that had a established plan of investment, of saving. They're living from hand to mouth, or they're either making payments on the refrigerator, the car, the piano, or some damn thing. See?